Chapters 1 through 6, it would be the story of Daniel. Right? And within the story, the scripture tells us some amazing narratives. Many of us are familiar with what happens with Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they get thrown into the fiery furnace. You guys are also probably aware of the story of Daniel, when he gets thrown and he stays the night inside of the lion's den, right? These first 6 chapters are full of amazing narratives, but the second half of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, it deals with what is known as the revelation of Daniel, right? The apocalyptic language of Daniel. You see, Daniel, he's going to go on to be visited by the angel Gabriel. He's going to be revealed some of the most amazing prophetic truths in the entire Bible. Prophecies about our Messiah, about the future of God's chosen people, and about critical events regarding the end times. But this mighty man of faith, he's gonna go on to accomplish amazing things for the Lord, things that have shaped the Christianity that you and I know here today. But what we're about to see is that long before Daniel's faith will ever close the mouth of lions, long before he'll ever influence kings, and he'll influence 4 mighty kings within his lifetime, long before he ever receives any prophecy from angels, Daniel was called by God to step into his purpose. But you see, Daniel's purpose, it didn't start once he was all grown up and he had it all figured out. No, Daniel's purpose started back here in chapter 1 when Daniel was no older than any of you guys that are in here today. At a time when he was called to make a choice and take a stand. You see, if Daniel doesn't survive chapter 1, well, then there is no fiery furnace. There is no lions. As a matter of fact, we probably never even hear the name of Daniel at all. And the choice that he was given to make was, will I be conformed to the world and all that it has to offer, or will I choose to live for the Lord and step into the purpose that he has for me? Now, we're going to pick up our study here in verse 3, but allow me to give you a little bit of background in order to catch us up to this point. You see, at this point in the text, in the scripture, the children of Israel, they have God's chosen people. They've continued to be disobedient to the Lord. They were commanded by God to obey him in a certain way and to behave in a certain way, but they just continued to not. And the Lord told them, he said, listen, you guys better tighten up. You guys better figure it out, because if you don't, then I'm going to be forced to deal with you. Any of you guys got parents that you've ever heard speak in this kind of way? I do. I got a mom who says that. I can't tell you how many times she said, boy, if that room is not clean by the time I get home from work, you're grounded. Right? This is what we're talking about. This is essentially what happened here. God told them over and over and over what was going to happen if they did not finally become obedient, and then they wouldn't. So eventually he had to put them in timeout. He had a foreign country come in, defeat Israel, and take them into captivity. You see, at this time, the Babylonian Empire, they were taking over the entire world, essentially. They had just finished a great battle, the Battle of Tarshish, where they took out the Egyptians and the Assyrians at the same time, and now they're the big dogs in town. So in 605 BC, they come into Israel. They defeat Israel. They defeat the capital city of Jerusalem. They set it on fire. They tear down the temple. And they took the best and the brightest of all of Israel, and they took them into captivity back in their nation of Babylon. And this is basically what's happened up until this point. So let's read from starting in verse 3. This is where we'll pick it up here this evening. In verse 3, it reads like this. It says, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. All right, so what I want to do is I want to break this chapter up into 4 sections. Right? And the first of these sections will be these verses 3 through 7 that we just read. And I want to call this first section the predicament. All right, this is the situation that Daniel and his friends, they find themselves in. And this is going to basically be the groundwork for what we're going to look at here this evening. We just read that the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, he sent his chief servant to gather up these specific young men and women, these young people who, mind you, are already equipped by God with everything that they could possibly need in order to fulfill their purpose. I mean, consider the description that we just read. It said that they had no blemish. They were good looking. They were full of wisdom. They were possessing knowledge. They were full of understanding, and they were able to serve. You see, the Babylonians, they targeted these kids who were already created in the likeness and the image of God. And Nebuchadnezzar, he started this process of assimilation. You guys are familiar with that word, assimilation? It means they want to change them from one way to the other. And I can tell you guys, this is the same deal when it comes to Satan's attack on our lives here today. Right, the Lord has already equipped everybody in this room. He has designed you perfectly in order to accomplish the purpose that he has for your life. The problem is our enemy knows that too. Matter of fact, he knows it better than any of us do. And because of this, he knows and he focuses his attack on first going after and destroying these very things. And that's exactly what we see from King Nebuchadnezzar here, right? And he does this by way of a 4-part process, right? The first way that he does this is by the way of isolation. I mean, just imagine what this must have been like for these kids. I mean, people come in, they kidnap them out of their homes. They take them 1,600 miles away from everything that they've ever known, and they bring them into the courts of the Babylonian king. They were isolated from all of their friends, from their parents, from their temple, from their worship, from all of their own religious influence. They're taken away from all these things, and they're brought into this brand new foreign environment. And the very first thing that the king of Babylon does is he isolates them. He takes them away from everything. And the second way was he indoctrinated them. He re-educated them. Now that he's got them isolated away from their friends and their families, he can start indoctrinating them. Notice what it says there in verse 4. It says that he would teach them the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And we might read this and be like, well, that doesn't sound too bad, right? Sounds like they were given a full scholarship to a big university overseas, right? But don't get it twisted, though. That's not the goal of Nebuchadnezzar. Was not to actually educate these kids. You see, the goal was to completely reorient their way of thinking into a Babylonian worldview. And this Babylonian worldview, it would have forbid them from speaking their own native tongue, and it would have only allowed them to speak and to learn the Chaldean language. This Babylonian worldview, it would have taught them that there was many, many, many gods, not just the one true God that they taught you back in Israel. That's not real. We have all of these gods for all of the different needs that you might have in your life. You know, archaeologists have discovered over the years that the Babylonians, that they were very much into divination. They would study the stars to be able to tell the future. They would take animal guts and entrails and put them on a plate and stir them around, and that's how they'd be able to tell prophecies. They worshiped pagan gods, and they relied on them in order to tell them information. And you see that the king's plan was to indoctrinate these kids by isolating them from everything that they've ever known and replacing that with the Babylonian way of life. And the plan was pretty simple, really. You're going to talk like us, you're going to walk like us, you're going to eat like us until eventually you're going to forget about who you ever were until one day when you're finally going to believe that you actually are one of us. That's the plan. And he does a pretty good job of it. Right? So they were isolated, they were indoctrinated, and the third phase into this plan was to intimidate them. Look at verse 5. It says in verse 5 that the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate. And some of your Bibles, mine will be the New King James or the King James, and it says the delicacies that the king ate. And of the wine that he drank, they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Right, so at first glance, this doesn't seem like a very big deal. I mean, awesome food, right? And they got to drink wine? They never got to do that back in Israel. Sign me up. Right? Not to mention the fact that these guys have been stolen from their homes. They've been treated like slaves. They probably hadn't been eaten very good. They certainly hadn't been treated very kindly. And now all of a sudden, they're being brought in like guests. They're being dressed with all the finest clothes. They're being offered this delicious food and this wine that they were never allowed to drink back at home. I mean, what's the big deal, right? It sounds like an upgrade to me. But the problem is just like all the other food and drink that was offered to the king there in Babylon, this food and drink was first offered to the pagan gods and to the idols. Right? And so the king, he would offer these foods which he knew would defile these Jewish boys, and he would do it as a way of intimidating them. But it wasn't just the food that was intimidating these guys. You got to understand, Babylon itself was wildly intimidating. But you got to picture what this place would have been like. I mean, imagine going from Lincoln, Maine, right? Going from Lincoln, Maine, and then going to a city like Babylon. Historians tell us that the city of Babylon, the walls were 80 feet thick. Right? We're told that they were 320 feet high and that they were 56 miles long. Right? That's the distance from here to the city of Bangor. That's how long the walls of this Babylonian city was. And then once you go through the huge gate called the Issachar Gate, you would come in and you would come to these roads of these streets of limestone, which were 65 miles wide. All of the walls would have been ornated with gold and with pearls and with emeralds. You had the river Euphrates that ran down the center of it. Right? Then you would see the most majestic palace that you've ever seen in your entire life. And not to mention one of the 7 wonders of the world was the Hanging Garden of Babylon. I mean, this city, the scene they would have stepped into would have made any Jewish kid's jaw drop to the floor. It would have been the most beautiful place they'd ever seen in their entire life. And all of a sudden, they're being ushered into it and treated like royalty. They're being dressed in the finest clothes. They're being offered the best teachings. They're being offered all of this food, all these delicacies, all of this wine. Everybody's got a smile on their face, and they're trying to usher them into the Babylonian way. You understand? It was this form of intimidation that the king of Babylon was offering to these young men. But the fourth thing that Nebuchadnezzar did was that he re-identified them. So you see, first he isolated them, and then he indoctrinated them, and then he intimidated them. But the fourth thing he did was he re-identified them. Right? He took them away, and he took away their most personal and their most precious possession, their names. You saw what he said there. They changed Daniel's name to Belshazzar. They changed Hananiah's name to Shadrach, Mishael's name to Meshach, and Azariah's name to Abednego. But the really interesting thing is that these Hebrew names, the ones that he changed it from, these names all had real special meanings. You see, Daniel's name meant God is my judge. Hananiah's name meant beloved by the Lord. Mishael means who is like God, and Azariah means the Lord is my help. And we see here that the king, he changed these boys' names from these names that honored the Lord to other names that pointed to pagan gods. Now, you guys might look at this predicament that I'm painting here for you about Daniel and his friends, and you might think to yourself, all right, Aaron, what does that got to do with me? That's 3,000 years ago. What does that got to do with me sitting here in Lincoln, Maine in 2025? But I want to point out to you guys, listen, this is one thing that you'll find as you look through our scriptures. Satan's playbook doesn't change very much. He's really, really good at what he does, and he's got a new batch of us coming through every generation. So his playbook doesn't change. We face these very same predicaments today. Think about it. First, the king isolated these kids. Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but Satan's number one objective right away for any of us is to get us alone. is to get us away from our family, to get us away from our youth pastor, to get us away from any positive influence that he can. Right? And he wants to get you to a place where he can speak his lies into your ears, and then he can usher in the second phase, right? The indoctrination. And this indoctrination is happening all around us every day. Once I'm isolated from my friends, from my church, from the influences of the Lord, he can begin to change the way that I talk, the way that I do things, right? The way that I think. I'll start seeing life in a totally different way because he's going to start re-educating me through the things of this world. And then he intimidates me. He shows me all the glitz and the glamour of everything around me in this world. He offers all of these delicacies that are so appealing. And what are those delicacies for us today? Well, you guys know what they are. It's all the things that the world tries to convince us that we've got to have, or else we're never going to be satisfied. The relationships, the sex, the partying, the showing our bodies all over social media, the having a following on social media. All these things that I gotta have. If I don't have those things, I'm nobody. And you see, the enemy, he'll intimidate us into believing that if we don't eat of these delicacies, well, then we're gonna starve to death. We're gonna certainly starve to death. And then lastly, he re-identifies them. Remember, we saw he changed their names. He attempted to erase who they truly were. And I got a feeling some of us in this room, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about his attempt to do that. But if you're anything like me, then I can remember, sure, there was one time where I knew what my name was completely, right? I was confident. If you asked me what my name was, I could tell you right away what my identity was, who I was, and I stood on that. But then there was a point where the enemy, he got his claws into me. And he began to lie to me, and he began to rename me. And for some of us, those names are useless, fatherless, failure, overweight, ugly, unpopular. He's been saying that to us. He's been giving us that name for quite some time, renaming us. But perhaps you had a name that you always had to live up to. You always had to do whatever you could to be able to keep this name going, right? A name like quarterback or cheerleader, or valedictorian, or beautiful, or skinny, or popular, and you had to do whatever you must to be able to keep that name. That's who you were, that's your identity. If you lost that, you lost who you were. So you did whatever was necessary to make sure that that remained your name, and it became your identity. And the enemy did that by renaming us, by taking the name that the Lord gave us, and the identity that he gave us, and replacing it with something either that we couldn't stand, or something that we couldn't live without. You see, the predicament that we all find ourselves in, it's very similar to the one that Daniel did. Satan knows better than any of us that we were all created for a purpose. But he also knows that if he can succeed in changing your identity, then more than likely he can succeed in stopping your purpose. And that's his plan with Daniel and his friends, and it's his plan with us here today. So that's the predicament that these guys are in, right? And the predicament, it takes us into our second section of this chapter, which is what I call the protest. So we just read the situation where they're in. Now look at verse 8. What's the first word that you see there in verse 8? But, right? But Daniel. Notice it doesn't say so Daniel. It doesn't say therefore Daniel. It says but Daniel. You see, immediately we have opposition to the pressure. The pressure introduced in those first 7 verses, it's met with a protest from Daniel to what was happening. You see what we have here? We've got a young teenage Daniel who is making a choice. And the choice is, do I compromise or do I not compromise? Look what he says there in verse 8. It says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Notice that Daniel's choice, it began with an inward conviction within his own heart. Right? All of the isolation, all of the indoctrination, all of the intimidation, all of the re-identification only led to solidifying young Daniel's determination. You see, this young Jewish teenager, miles away from his own home, in the middle of this foreign land, he decided in his own heart to draw a line. He said, I might be in Babylon, but Babylon's not going to be in me. He made that decision. And let me tell you, the ability to not compromise, guys, it's always an inside job. It's always an inside job. Just like we see here from Daniel, when your decisions become your convictions. You know, anybody can make a decision, but when it becomes a conviction, when it becomes who you are, and you can't bring yourself to do anything else, right? That's when it becomes different. That's when it changes into being something that you can stand on. Let me tell you guys something, right? The effectiveness of the rest of Daniel's life depended on this moment right here in verse 8. It all depends on this moment right here. The choice not to compromise this day will determine the man that Daniel was going to become every single day afterwards. It was this moment right here. An old theologian named W.A. Criswell, he once said it like this. He said, all of life is filled with crises and decisions. He said there are right decisions, wrong decisions, high road, low roads, and almost every day there will be a fork in the road. He said, where you are today is due to the turn in the road that you took yesterday. You got to understand the purpose in which God calls you to tomorrow will be determined by the compromises that you choose to refuse today. I once heard a story about a father who had really high standards for his family and the kind of influence that his family could be exposed to. And one day a popular movie came out, and his 3 teenagers, they decided that they wanted to see this movie. So they decided they were going to interview some of their friends who had already seen the movie, and they were going to take the information and they were going to write a pros and cons list for their father and deliver it to him in an attempt to appeal to be able to see this movie. And they brought the list to their father, and they said, Father, you know, we know that this movie's got some parts in it that don't exactly align with our values, but they're very minimal portions of the movie, not much there at all, actually. And I think that you'll see that overall it's a very good movie and a very tasteful movie, and I think it would be okay that we just overlook the bad parts and you allowed us to see this movie. And the father told them that he'd like time to think about it. He said he'll give them their answer in 24 hours. So the next day, he calls his 3 teenagers down to the kitchen, and he tells them to come in, that he's made his decision. And when they come into the kitchen, they see that there's this big batch of freshly baked brownies. And the father says, okay, kids, I've made my decision. I've decided that I'll allow you guys to go and watch this movie on there's only one stipulation. You can go watch the movie if you will have a piece of these brownies that I just made. He said, but listen, before you answer me, I want to give you a pros and cons list about these particular brownies. He says, these brownies, they're made with the finest award-winning chocolate. He said, it's absolutely amazing. They are fresh, they are moist. I mean, they'll literally just melt in your mouth. They've just come out of the oven. The only con is that you guys know that Doberman that lives across the street. I put some of his dog poop in this brownies. It's just a little bit. There's not much at all. Matter of fact, there's hardly any at all. You probably won't even notice that it's there. Matter of fact, after cooking the brownies at 350 degrees, most of the dog poop is probably evaporated up in it. You probably won't even notice it amongst all that rich chocolatey goodness. I'm sure it won't be an issue whatsoever. And if any of you will eat just one piece of these brownies, I'll drive you to the movies myself. Well, as you guys can imagine, the teenagers did not go and watch that movie, did they? And they recognized exactly what their dad was trying to tell them. They recognized that day that even the smallest amount of compromise will surely ruin the whole batch. You know, and I wonder how many times you and I have gone through life and we've had to make these kinds of decisions. There I am. I finally got that friend group that I've always wanted. Man, I'm finally sitting at the cool table. I'm finally sitting with the cool kids. Are you kidding me? They know my name, and they're letting me sit here. This is amazing. But now they're asking me to do some things that I'm not exactly comfortable with. Right now they're asking me to act in a type of way that would compromise who I really am. And now I've got to make a decision. And am I going to do what it takes in order to be cool, in order to be accepted, in order to remain in this position that I've somehow finally made it to? Or am I going to stand for Jesus? And am I going to seek the purpose that he has for me and stand upon the convictions of who I am? And how do God's people resist the pressures that have a way of squeezing us into conformity with the world, right? Romans chapter 12, verse 2. You guys, I'm sure, have heard the verse. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. You see, according to the Bible, conformers are those whose lives are controlled by outside pressures. But for you and I, we're called to be transformers. That's who we're supposed to be. We're called to be those whose lives are led and called by, and changed, by a power that lives within us. Let me ask you guys a question. Are you a thermometer or a thermostat? In my house, we've got both. In my house, we've got a thermometer that hangs outside of my, right in my window, and it'll tell me how hot the room is. It'll tell me how cold the room is. But the thing about that thermometer is that thermometer, it changes according to the temperature inside of that room. If it's cold that day, that thermometer the heat will go, the thermometer number will go down. If it's warm in that room, it will go up. It is determined by the external factors around it. But then in my living room, we've also got a thermostat. You see, a thermostat works quite differently. See, if it's too cold in that room, I can turn the heat up on that thermostat. If it's too hot in that room, I can turn it down on that thermostat. You see, the thermostat, it changes the temperature in the room. But the thermometer is changed by the temperature in the room. Do you understand what I'm saying? Which one are you? Are you a thermometer? Are you changed depending on who's around you? Are you changed depending on where you are? Are you changed depending on the influences and the factors and the feelings that you're going through? Does that change your convictions? Does it change your temperature? Does it change who you are? Or are you a thermostat? Are you that one who steps into a room and you change the temperature of the room? You come in with the convictions of Jesus. You come in with a foundation that you've learned in youth group. You come in with the love of Christ that is so contagious, it changes the temperature in the room wherever you go. Are you a thermometer or are you a thermostat? Romans 12, verse 2 says, do not be conformed. Don't be a thermometer. He says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can be a thermostat wherever you go. Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. Joshua says to the Israelites, he says, choose for this day whom you will serve, whether the gods in which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, of whose land you now dwell. He says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua is saying, listen, guys, you got to make a call. You got to make a decision. You got to choose. Who are you going to serve? You're going to serve the gods that your mom and your dad served and the mistakes that they made or where you were, where you've been. Or you're going to serve the gods that are in front of you right now, the ones that are vying for your attention every single day that your peers are serving and all the. Or are you going to serve the Lord? Make a decision here and now. Am I going to serve that back there? Am I going to serve, or am I going to serve the Lord? So Daniel, his protest began with an inward conviction. But I also want you guys to check this out and take note of this. It also included a spiritual definition. Notice that Daniel, he doesn't see the delicacies offered to him as delicacies. No, instead, Daniel, what does he see? He sees the delicacies as defilement. Daniel wasn't all excited about his opportunity to partake in something that his parents would never allow or that his Christian friends would never agree to. He wasn't fired up like, are you kidding me? This is awesome. No, look what he said again in verse 8. It says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And you guys understand, the big deal with this, right, is that Daniel and his friends are Jewish. And being Jewish kids, that means that there was stuff that they could eat and stuff that they, could not eat. If it was something they could eat, it was called kosher. If it was something that you could not eat, it was non-kosher or unkosher. And every bit of the food, we just mentioned this, that was offered in the king's court was already sacrificed and poured out to idols, making it very much unkosher. This was not something they could touch. They had to step off into a huge compromise in order to touch this. And probably some of you guys are thinking to yourselves, all right, yeah, cool, what's the big deal? Right? I mean, when in Rome, right? I mean, the parents aren't around, right? Their friends aren't around, your youth pastor's not there. Nobody's gonna know what's the big deal. I mean, you step in, you step out, there's nothing. And listen, Daniel could have had all the excuses that he needed. He had everything was in his favor just to say, hey, I had no choice. What was I supposed to do? I was 1,600 miles from anything I've ever known. There were Babylonians everywhere. Everybody else was doing it. I mean, I had no choice. I had to. You understand? But here's the thing, right? Daniel wasn't looking for excuses because Daniel was living with purpose. And when you're living with purpose, you're no longer looking for excuses. You see, Daniel, he was basically saying to the king and to the chief of the eunuchs, he says, listen, man, you can isolate me, you can indoctrinate me, you can intimidate me, you can try to re-identify me, but you're never going to change me, right? Because I have a purpose that has been given to me by my God. And you see, Daniel, he teaches us a very important lesson here, that you and I must first develop the conviction to say no if we ever hope to have the opportunity to say yes. That's how it works. That's how that works. Right? The Lord had a great purpose for young Daniel, but it all started with the decisions that he was going to make right here when he was just a teenager. Because you see, when you close the door on defilement, you then in turn get to open the door to development. And these are the opportunities the Lord will give. These are those moments that the Lord will present to us so that we can choose him, as Joshua said, and then we can step into the purpose that he has for us. But listen, everything that we've been talking about here, everything that we've already looked at for Daniel, it is all accomplished by a life that lives as though God is always watching. You know, far too often, we can find ourselves making decisions based on who might find out or who might not find out, or the consequence that might be there or might not be there. All right, so we look this way and we look that way. Problem is, we never look that way, do we? We don't look up. You know, when we're living a life that's the same, whether I'm in church or whether or not I'm at school, right? Making decisions as though God is always watching, as though the cameras are always rolling, as though the microphone is always on. When I start living my life according to the idea that God is in my presence, that's when I can start stepping into my purpose. The Bible says that the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all of his paths. You guys remember the story of Moses? Right? You remember before Moses was the great leader that would go, take the Israelites through the wilderness? Moses was living back in Egypt. And there was one day when he came down and he saw an Egyptian who was beating up a couple of his Hebrew brothers. Remember what the scripture says? It says, Moses looked this way, and Moses looked that way. But no, Moses never looked that way. And it tells us he ended up murdering that guy, and he ends up having to run for 40 years out into the desert. But we see from our text here with Daniel, he doesn't have this problem. You see, even though he's just a teenager, even though nobody's around, Daniel refuses to compromise. And we see this here in verse 8. So we've seen now the predicament that Daniel found himself in. Right? We've seen the protest that Daniel puts up against it, but now I want you guys to take a look at the third portion of this chapter, and that is the petition. Look again, we'll start in verse 8. It says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? so you would endanger my head with the king." Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said, "Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youth who eat the king's delicacies be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." Verse 14, "So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. So the first thing I want you guys to see here is, you see in verse 8, it says that Daniel requested to the chief of the eunuchs. Daniel was respectful. Right? Even though he was dealing with something that was a very serious conviction of his, right? He still was respectful. In verse 12, it says that he asked him, he said, "Please test your servants." Daniel and his friends weren't picketing in the streets. They weren't cussing anybody out. They weren't, writing a crazy rant on social media. No, these guys still, regardless of the situation, they continue to represent the Lord by being polite and being respectful. And as a result of this, the Lord gives Daniel favor with the chief of the eunuchs. And this is the guy who is he's been given the job to assimilate these boys. Right? And now the Lord has given Daniel favor with this guy. I mean, the guy's still pretty sketched out. You hear what he said? He says, "Listen, guys, this king, I don't know if you know, this guy's in the business of chopping people's heads off. And if he finds out that I've gone against what he's told me to do for you guys, he's gonna take my head." And Daniel goes, I get it. Hold on, man. I got a plan." He says, "All right, I'll make you a deal. How about you just try it? Let us eat vegetables for 10 days. Nothing crazy is gonna happen in 10 days. Right? But if the 10 days, if you see that we're still, worse for wear and we're starting to decline, we'll eat whatever you want. Right? Put us on the delicacies, put us on your diet plan, whatever." He goes, "But when our God delivers us and when he takes care of us and there's no difference, you got to let us eat the vegetables going forward." And then the eunuch says, "All right, bet. Yeah, we'll do that. I'm cool with that." And the Lord gave them favor with the chief of the eunuchs. Now, of course, you guys realize, right, that the big issue with everything that we've been looking at so far in this whole situation, the big deal is that belief that without the delicacies of the king's delicacies, that these guys would never be satisfied. That's the deal, right? That's the whole issue, is based around the idea that if they didn't eat the king's delicacies, they'd never be satisfied. If they didn't partake in his food and his wine, that they would be starving for everything that these foods offered. And listen, when we look around at our world today, right, and the delicacies of the world that we live in, the delicacies that are set on the table before all of us, can't we sometimes find ourselves assuming the same exact thing? Can't we become convinced that if we don't partake in the delicacies of this world, that we are going to be starving and never satisfied in the ways that it seems like the rest of the world gets to be? I can still remember when I was in high school, and I was looking at that table that was set before me, all the different delicacies of this world, right? And I remember having this assumption, this obsession that I was never going to be satisfied. I was never going to be able to have what these other kids had if I didn't partake in those, right? And some of these were, one of the delicacies was partying. This idea that if I didn't join everybody wherever they were partying that weekend, that I was never going to have any friendship or companionship. I was never going to be cool. How could I, right? I'll never be accepted. I'll never be seen by anybody because they're all off at whoever's house, and I'm sitting at home because I won't do that thing. So I assumed without that delicacy, I'd never be satisfied in the way that they were. Or how about this one? Relationships, or more specifically, having sex within that relationship, right? Let's face it, you and I, we live in a culture that obsesses over all of these things. A culture that convinces me that if I don't hook up, that nobody's ever gonna be able to want me. Before long, I started to believe that the only way that I could show love, or the only way that I would be able to know that somebody loved me, or they could show love to me, was through some kind of action. Instead of the loyalty that they had for me. Or instead of trying to honor the Lord in my process of finding a wife or finding a husband, I assumed that there was supposed to be all this other stuff, and I didn't do it. Well, nobody's ever going to want me. Nobody's ever going to want to date me. Nobody's ever going to want to look at me because I'm going to be the weirdo. I'm going to be a prude. I'm going to be all this. And this was my mindset. It was no different with drugs and alcohol. The assumption that everybody was doing it, that everybody was either drinking or smoking weed or popping pills or they were doing all these different things. I was certain that if I didn't partake in these, that I wasn't going to be cool. I was never going to have what these other kids had. I was never going to be able to fit in because that's what everybody was doing. Right? You know what's a big one now? And even for adults, this isn't just for kids. One of these delicacies of the world is social media, man. This desire to validate, or for validation or for self-worth that comes through the attention that I receive off of a video or off of a picture, right? These little digital hearts that if I get them, I'm validated, and if I don't get them, it deflates me within a single moment. Well, they think I'm ugly. Well, they don't care. Well, I can't believe that. The influence that an algorithm can have on the way that I behave or the way that I see the world, it's uncanny. It's unbelievable. You know, for us men, we can get convinced that the way that I'm supposed to treat a girl or the way that I'm supposed to be a man is based on what I'm seeing through this algorithm and through these videos that are popping up on my phone. Right? And for girls, the idea that this is how I'm supposed to look pretty. This is how I'm supposed to act. And if I don't act like this, well, then I'm just... It's an amazing thing how our self-worth is tied up into a screen with people we've never met. And with situations that, truth be told, don't even exist. Most of them are staged. Most of them are made up. Most of them are one in a million. But there's this obsession behind it. And guys, listen to me. These delicacies, they're set on this table in front of us every single day. They can be so appealing. They can be so tempting. They can be so desirable. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether this delicacy is, whether it's pornography, whether it's cursing in the words that I say, whether it's getting into fights, whether it's the way that I treat people when certain other people are around, so that I can get the attention or the affirmation of a certain group of people. Right? The truth is, because it seems like everybody's doing it, and it offers such an instant gratification, we can start to believe, just like this eunuch, that if we don't eat of the king's delicacies, we're going to starve. Right? I'm going to be deprived. I'm going to be deprived of all these things that they can offer. And before long, I can find myself compromising who I really am in order to eat of the delicacies and of the table of the world. But it was Lord Jesus who said, I am the bread of life. He said, whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Psalm 107 says, for he satisfies the longing soul, and he fills the hungry soul with goodness. Psalm 63 says, my soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich foods, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. You see, Daniel, he knew to eat of the king's delicacy would have defiled him and would have kept him from his purpose. And even though all of his friends were doing it, and understand me when I say that, there were thousands of kids who were brought from Israel into Babylon. Thousands of them. The Bible only tells us of 4 who put up a fight. Everybody was doing it. Everybody was eating at that table. Everybody was soaking it up. Everybody was just diving into it. And we're going to see that again if you continue in the book, where you see that only Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down. Everybody was bowing down to the statue, except for these 3 guys, and they get thrown into a fiery furnace for it. These 4 boys are standing in a sea of people who are willing to compromise, and they stood their grounds. You see, they knew that God had created them for a purpose, and they knew that that purpose relied upon the way that they refused to compromise way back here while they're teenagers in chapter 1. But I want to close our text this evening with the 4th and the final section. Right? So we've seen the predicament, we've seen the petition, and we've seen the protest. The protest and the petition. Now I want to look at the purpose. Let's finish up here. Let's see how this whole thing shakes out. Look at verse 15. Verse 15 says, At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's delicacies. So the steward took away their food and the wine and that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So we see, first of all, that after 10 days of eating just veggies and water, they were healthier and they were fatter than everybody else. And of course, the assumption is that without the king's delicacies, they were going to be starving. They were going to be miserable. But as it turns out, they were healthier and happier than all of them. And not only that, you see the Lord, he began to bless them and give them favor. It says that he gave them more knowledge and skill and wisdom and understanding in dreams and visions. And when the king interviewed them 3 years later, right after it was all, the whole assimilation process was up, he called them in, he interviewed them, and he found that these 4 boys, they were not just as smart as everybody else. Do you see what it said there in verse 20? It says, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. You see, because of these young men's faith and because of their obedience, they didn't just survive. These guys thrived, man. They didn't just manage not to starve. These boys were filled in ways that they could have never possibly imagined. You see, Daniel's decision back here in chapter 1, it prepared him for many greater moments as he's going to continue his life, no doubt. 70 years of captivity, Daniel will be there in Babylon, influencing king after king after king. He's going to interpret the king Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. He's going to be delivered by God from the lion's den. He's going to receive important prophecy from the angel Gabriel. He's even going to be the leading influence on the wise men centuries from this point, who will travel from the east and follow a star all the way to Jerusalem in order to come and worship and bring gifts to the king baby Jesus. Daniel is going to be that influence. Daniel is going to be the reason for all of this. But I think there's an important principle here, guys. That your faithfulness now will set you up for what God will do later. A small yes today prepares you for even bigger purposes tomorrow. You see, the world that we live in wants to do the very same thing that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do. It wants to conform you through peer pressure, through entertainment, through social media. And the message that the enemy uses, it's very simple. Everybody's doing it. Just go with the flow. You only live once, right? YOLO. It's the same message. But guys, I've come here this evening. If you hear anything that I say, I hope that you hear this. Going with the flow is a cop-out. It's too simple. It's too easy. Listen to me. Even a dead fish can flow downstream. You understand that, right? Even a dead fish can flow downstream. My challenge to you guys here this morning or this evening, swim like a salmon. Swim out your faith like a salmon. Swim upstream, man. Swim against the odds and pursue Jesus and everything that he has called you to, right? Because I promise you right now, he's called you to be his child. He's called you to know his love, and he's called you to live with an eternal purpose. You see, young Daniel, he had decided, him and his friends, they made a choice. Whether or not they were going to conform to this world and they were just going to go with the flow, or they were going to refuse to compromise and they were going to commit their lives to God. And the truth is, as every single one of us here in this room tonight, we're given this very same choice. For you kids, for you guys that are already believers, your question is, will you choose to live for your purpose, even when it might cost you everything? And for any of you in here who are non-believers, you're here because somebody brought you here, or you heard about it, and you're here for the first time, right? The question to you is, will you recognize that your true purpose begins, just like Daniel, in submitting your life to God and the moment that he's brought you to? Just like verse 8. He brought Daniel to a moment where he could go left or he could go right. He brought him to that moment, and it was all about that moment. That decision that he would make right then and there would determine where his life would end up, what the trajectory would look like. You know, it's like getting the new iPhone 17, right? It's like going and picking up the new iPhone 17. It's got all the features. It's got all the best cameras. I mean, this thing is sweet. But without a charger, it's absolutely useless. It's just a $1,500 shiny piece of metal. You understand? That's us without God. Right? We were designed for him, and your life will never make sense without him. So my appeal to you guys here tonight is, don't waste your youth. Don't believe the lie that your life is just meaningless, right? Each and every one of you in here was created for a purpose, and a specific one. You were created for a purpose. You were created for God's purpose. And the only question is, will you choose that purpose tonight? Will you choose it? You're going to get an opportunity to be able to be prayed for. You're going to get an opportunity to be able to submit yourself to the Lord, whether or not that's submitting to the purpose that he has for you, because he has one for every one of us. If you don't know what that purpose is, cry out to the Lord. Ask him what it is. Ask him to solidify you. Ask him to give you the boldness to stand on your convictions. Ask him to give you the boldness to stand apart, to swim upstream in a world that is pulling and is crying out for you to go with the flow. Be that thermostat that'll change the temperature in the room. That's the purpose. Yes, that's what he's called you to today, not in 10 years. Not when you get it figured out, not when you're a husband or a wife and you got kids and you got a job. Forget about all that. Today, right now, tomorrow, when you step out of your house, Monday, when you step into that school, the Lord has a purpose for you now. What is it? Are you seeking it? Do you want to know what it is? Do you want to know how you can prepare and position yourself for it? And if you don't know the Lord in here tonight, if you've never met him, if he's been grabbing at you, you're hearing this message right now, he's speaking to your heart, you'll have an opportunity to first submit yourself to him, give your life to him, and then buckle up and get ready for the most amazing adventure of your life. Because he has a purpose for every single one of you. And that purpose starts now. He wants to give it to you. And he wants to prepare you for it and empower you for it and position you in it. Our job is to cry out to him and say, I want to know. Daniel did that, right? Standing on your convictions is an inside job. It starts right here. Instead of verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart, you know what? I choose you, God. You're going to have an opportunity to choose God tonight. Pray with me, guys. Father, I thank you so much, Lord. Oh, you're so good. Lord, you are the God who calls us from our mother's womb, Lord. You knit us in our mother's womb. The Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Galatians that you called him to be an apostle from his mother's womb. Lord, you have settled your purpose for us, Lord, so long before we ever even lifted our eyes up to you, Lord. So long before you ever drug us to a conference and grabbed our hearts and spoke to us and shook us and drew us to the front to give you our lives. So long before we knew you, you knew us. You had a purpose for us. You had a plan. And Lord, you intend to use us each and every day as a thermostat that would change the temperature wherever we go, as we swim our faith out like a salmon upstream, Lord, leading a pack behind us, Lord, with your wisdom and your direction. So, Father, I ask you to please, Lord, just continue to work on our hearts here tonight, Lord. Continue to speak to us, even now as we go into this song, Lord. I pray, Lord, that you would continue to till the soil, Lord, and plant the seed and grow it right here now, instantly, Lord, so that you would change hearts and we would respond, Lord, to what you have for us. We love you so much, and we give you all the praise and all the glory and all the honor. Amen.
Hey, don't disappear.
All right.